Hello, and welcome to the Great Tradition Podcast. My name is Alec, and this podcast exists to help you learn about the 2,000 years of Christians who came before us so that we can become more like God. What if I told you that over 1,700 years ago, a group of Egyptian dudes who wandered off into the desert to pray in silence inspired perhaps the most influential spiritual tradition in history? I'm talking about the Desert Fathers, and perhaps, to the surprise of some, this group of ancient dudes may be the most influential group of Christians in world history. Throughout Christian history, the memory of these humble men has inspired everything from the Eastern and Western Christian ascetic traditions, many renewal movements, and even mass evangelization. Whether we're thinking of St. Francis's emulation of these fathers, Augustine of Hippo's conversion while reading the life of Anthony, or even the lesser-known men responsible for evangelizing the whole of Northern Europe, the Desert Fathers inspired them all. So, who were these men, and what did they do that inspired some of the greatest Christian movements in history? To tell this story, we must travel half the world over to Alexandria, Egypt, somewhere in the 3rd century AD. It's an age of sporadic but intense persecution, but also an age of hope. Along the same Nile where Pharaoh bloodied the water with the lives of innocent Hebrew children in the Exodus account, Rome bloodied the ground with the lives of the Christian martyrs. But what was slavery to Israel was conquering to the Christians. Christ had died and risen and promised resurrection life to all his followers. To die for the faith, then, was to witness to the resurrection power of Christ through the hope of the resurrection. Yet, death by state execution was not the only way to witness to the resurrection power of Christ. One might also die to oneself daily by holy living, purity of heart, and pure love. This is how, after Constantine seized control at the turn of the 4th century and legalized the Christian religion, we could still find the Church witnessing to the resurrection. To live the ascetic lifestyle, a life strategically depriving oneself of everything except needs, and living a life of love and contemplation, was to become a martyr in a new age of peace. The foremost exemplars of this way of life were the men we know as the Desert Fathers. The Desert Fathers were a group of Christians who withdrew from the world to live for God. They sought the heavenly life on earth, through lives of abstinence, continence, discipline, and love. Contrary to some popular misconceptions, the Desert Fathers did not abandon their former lives to live alone in the desert. They didn't believe that one could live the Christian life alone, or that Christian spirituality was a purely inward pursuit. For them, Christianity was communal and relational. Before ever venturing into the desert alone, these men lived and trained under one another, ministering to one another through psalms, encouragements, and many prayers. Yet, when they finally made their way into the deeper regions of the desert to live in solitude, disciples and visitors often flocked to them. Just as happened with Jesus, when he withdrew to the desert to be alone with the Father, the crowds couldn't keep away, but would travel to meet him. And just as Jesus had compassion on those who crowded him, so too the Desert Fathers entertained many with deep kindness and hospitality. But even when they were deprived of human company, they were never alone in any true sense. God was present, and so were the angelic and demonic hosts. Even when isolated from other people, they were never alone and always attempting to draw near to the Lord and fight against the temptations of the enemy. Their goal was purity of heart, without which they would not see the God they so loved. St. Anthony is perhaps the most influential Desert Father in history. Interestingly, we actually have some letters he was purported to have dictated, but apart from that, we don't know of anything Anthony wrote. Our primary source about the man comes from Athanasius of Alexandria's Life of Anthony, which he wrote to encourage his fellow Christians to follow Christ more fully. For, as Athanasius says, the life of Anthony is a sufficient pattern of discipline. Anthony was an Egyptian, born to considerably wealthy Christian parents. Upon their death around the age of 18 or 20, he took responsibility for his sister. However, one day as he came to church, he reflected on the apostles and how they left everything to follow Christ. When he arrived in the church, he heard Matthew 19:21, "If you would be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor, and come, follow me, and you shall have treasure in heaven." Anthony took this as a call from God and sold his productive 300-acre farm and gave it to the poor. Reserving a bit of money for his sister, he committed her to the care of some virgins in the local convent and left to learn the monastic discipline. From there, Anthony found an old man who had lived as a hermit from his youth up and began following him. Let me repeat that. He found an old man who had lived his whole life in the discipline Anthony was committing his life to, and he imitated him. A lot of times I've heard people talk about the Desert Fathers as though they were these antisocial, solitary people who desired to keep away from other people, and, to be fair, in some of their writings, we can get that impression. But people who see the Desert Fathers this way miss the fact that living alone in the desert, what we know as the anchoritic way of life, was an advanced stage of desert life. Any anchorite was first a disciple. Community always preceded the solitary life. And Anthony sought community. If he heard of a good man anywhere, says Athanasius, like a prudent bee, he went forth and sought him, nor turned back to his own palace until he had seen him. And he returned, having got from the good man, as it were, supplies for his journey in the way of virtue. Whatever admirable qualities he saw in these men, he would imitate and try to unite in himself. His only rivalry with his peers was to surpass them in higher things, which he did in a way that made his peers rejoice over them instead of being bitter. However, Anthony's pursuit of the Lord did not go unnoticed, and it irritated the devil, and Anthony was besieged with the temptation of lust, which, through prayer, fasting, and the grace of God, he overcame. Having overcome that temptation, he didn't stop or relax his pursuit of God. As a pattern, when things got easier for Anthony, he didn't take it as a chance to relax, but as a chance to double down on his disciplines and pursue Christ, with greater tenacity. As Athanasius says, he gave no thought to the past, but, day by day, as if he were beginning his discipline, applied greater pains for advancement, often repeating to himself the saying of Paul in Philippians 3:14, forgetting the things which are behind and stretching forward to the things which are before. Eventually, Anthony made his way to the tombs, a distance from the village, and stayed there alone. There goes Athanasius' story. Anthony encountered a multitude of demons that beat him near to death. A friend who would bring him bread found him and brought him to the church, where he laid, as though dead, until midnight, when he woke up and asked his friend to bring him back to the tombs. There Anthony prayed, "Here am I, Anthony. I flee not from your stripes, for even if you inflict more, nothing shall separate me from the love of Christ." And he sang, "Though a camp be set against me, my heart shall not be afraid." The demons took on the shape of many different animals, like bulls and wolves, which harmed him physically. But Anthony responded, "If there had been any power in you, it would have sufficed had one of you come. But since the Lord has made you weak, you attempt to terrify me by numbers. And a proof of your weakness is that you take the shapes of brute beasts." And again with boldness he said, "If you are able and have received power against me, delay not to attack. But if you're unable, why trouble me in vain? For faith in our Lord is a seal and a wall of safety to us." After this, they left ashamed, and the Lord came to Anthony, telling them that he had been present to him all along, but waited to see his fight. Since he endured, Christ said he would make Anthony's name known everywhere. Anthony traded the tombs for a cave where he trained in solitude for nearly 20 years. At the end of this period, he had become such a legend that many wanted to become his disciple, and came to his cave, literally knocking his door in to see him. Athanasius says, "Then, for the first time, he was seen outside the fort by those who came to see him. And they, when they saw him, wondered at the sight, for he had the same habit of body as before, and was neither fat like a man without exercise, nor lean from fasting and striving with the demons, but he was just the same as they had known him before his retirement. And again, his soul was free from blemish, for it was neither contracted as if by grief, nor relaxed by pleasure, nor possessed by laughter or dejection, for he was not troubled when he beheld the crowd, nor overjoyed at being saluted by so many, but he was altogether, even as being guided by reason, and abiding in the natural state. Through him the Lord healed the bodily ailments of many present, and cleansed others from evil spirits. And he gave grace to Anthony in speaking, so that he consoled many that were sorrowful, and set those at variance at once, exhorting all to prefer the love of Christ before all that is in the world. And while he exhorted and advised them to remember the good things to come, and the loving kindness of God towards us, who spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, he persuaded many to embrace the solitary life. And thus it happened, in the end, that cells arose even in the mountains, and the desert was colonized by monks, who came forth from their own people, and enrolled themselves for the citizenship in the heavens. So their cells, as Athanasius says in a different passage, were in the mountains, like filled with holy bands of men who sang psalms, loved reading, fasting, prayed, rejoiced in the hope of things to come, labored in almsgiving, and preserved love and harmony with one another. And truly it was possible, as it were, to behold a land set by itself, filled with piety and justice, for then there was neither the evildoer, nor the injured, nor the reproaches of the tax-gatherer, but instead a multitude of ascetics, and the one purpose of them all was to aim at virtue. After this, the persecution of Maximinus took place in Alexandria. Anthony left his cell and ministered to the confessors in the mines and prisons, and encouraged those on their way to martyrdom. While Anthony did not give himself up to martyrdom, he encouraged those on their way to death with such fearlessness that the judge over the persecutions commanded that no monk appear for judgment. The Romans were well aware that the blood of the martyrs is the seat of the church, and they did not want to execute the strong in faith, but the weak instead. They wanted to shame the Christians by their weakness, but Anthony and the monks were too brave, so they passed over them. Anthony even stood in his best watch garment before the governor one day, praying to receive martyrdom, but was passed up, and he grieved over this. He longed to imitate Christ, even in death. At another point in his life, Anthony was called further into the desert and followed a group of Saracens, the local nomadic people, to a spot that God directed him to. The Saracens weren't exactly friendly to Roman colonies in North Africa, but they liked Anthony so much that they would regularly bring him bread and enjoy his company. This only ceased after Anthony received some disciples from Alexandria, and he saw that one of them had trouble with him receiving it. At that point, Anthony made a garden and got his bread the old-fashioned way, from the work of his own hands. As more people would venture out into the desert to visit Anthony, he cultivated a few pot herbs so that he might give them something refreshing after their long journey to see him. At first, however, the wild beasts in the desert, coming because of the water, often injured his seeds and husbandry, Athanasius tells us. But he gently, laying hold of one of them, said to them all, "Why do you hurt me, when I hurt none of you? Depart, and in the name of the Lord come not near this spot." And from that time forward, as though fearful of his command, they no more came near the place. As Anthony moved further into the desert, he seemed to receive more visitors. He even received visits from some pagan philosophers and a letter from the emperor at one point, thus repeating a pattern that we've seen several times already. Anthony withdraws from the world, grows in his personal piety, receives and disciples visitors, and then moves further into the desert and restarts that cycle. For Anthony, every peak was a base for the next climb. Every day was new and a means for Anthony to pursue Christ with all the strength that God's grace had provided him. Unto the day of his death, he kept his discipline and encouraged everyone who came to visit him. Athanasius describes him as he was nearing the end of his life. His eyes were undimmed and quite sound as he saw clearly. Of his teeth he had lost not one, but they had become worn to the gums through the great age of the old man. He remained strong both in hands and feet, and while all men were using various foods and washings and various garments, he appeared more cheerful and of greater strength. And the fact that his fame had been blazoned everywhere, and that all regarded him with wonder, and that those who have never seen him long for him, is clear proof of his virtue and God's love for his soul. For not from writings, nor from worldly wisdom, nor through any art was Anthony renowned, but solely from his piety towards God. That this was the gift of God, no one will deny. Anthony's story is a hero story, with both him and Christ being the hero. He embarks on his journey upon the call of Christ, who ultimately leads him to the desert to conquer the demonic foes congregated there. By the power of Christ, he defeats them and furthers his own salvation, as well as that of his community, who flock to him from near and far to witness the power and wisdom of Christ at work in the man. But, so as not to confuse the hero of the story, he asked to be buried secretly, that Christ be honored, not himself. Anthony wished to be an image of Christ, but never an idol replacing him. His disciples are called to continue the work of Christ, who, as the one who continues to be the hero, conquering the demonic kingdom through the weakness of the faithful, calls us to attack the gates of hell after the example of St. Anthony. The life of Anthony is an example for us to emulate, just as it was for Athanasius' argument 1700 years ago. In our next episode, we're going to unpack the basic theology of the Desert Fathers and explain why someone like Anthony would feel traveling into the desert was a way of serving Christ in love. If you've enjoyed this content, please consider liking or subscribing. If you have any thoughts on how we can improve or what topics you would like to see us cover next, drop us a comment. God bless.